Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's Che Alaska webinar. Today's discussion is going to be on the Arctic's plastic crisis, dangers to health and human rights of Indigenous peoples. So we will be covering how the effects of plastic pollution, petrochemical operations, and climate change are all compounding to harm health and well-being of people in the Arctic. My name is Sarah Banapur. I'm the Communications Coordinator with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT. And before we get started, I want to note that Che Alaska is a program of ACAT and Collaborative for Health and Environment, and it's also part of Che's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. So for today's webinar, as always, feel free to send in your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the presentations. And at the end of the webinar, we'll get to as many as we can within the hour. So we have three amazing speakers joining us today. We have Dr. Therese Karlsson. She is the Science and Technical Advisor at the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN. And we have Pamela Miller, ACAT's Executive Director and IPEN's co-chair. And the two of them are the lead authors of a joint ACAT-IPEN report on the Arctic that they're going to be talking about today. And we're so happy to have Dr. Dalee Sambo Dorough joining us. She is a senior scholar and special advisor on Arctic Indigenous Peoples at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And today she's going to be talking to us about the most critical issues affecting health and human rights in the Arctic. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Sambo Dorough to get us started.
Hianak, thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me to thank Sarah and Pam for the invitation to share some remarks with you today, and also to thank Pam and Therese for the important report that they invited me to share a foreword to. I think it's quite significant, the work that's being done. And most importantly, also, I want to express my appreciation to the Arctic Indigenous peoples that have been engaged directly in the negotiation of a hoped-for comprehensive international legally binding treaty on plastics and microplastics. Today, I want to swiftly move through what I deem to be crucial issues concerning health, human rights, and the Arctic environment, emphasizing our human rights as distinct Indigenous peoples. Trying to advance my slides. And I don't know why they're not advancing. There we go. In the earliest days of organizing of Inuit across Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, one of the key objectives was to prepare an Arctic policy. And I think it's quite significant that this was in the mid to late 70s. Today, you have states all over the globe, many far from the Arctic, preparing Arctic policies and Arctic strategies. But I think it's quite significant that Inuit themselves, as Indigenous peoples, began to prepare the principles and elements for a comprehensive Arctic policy. And many of the provisions in the Inuit Arctic policy made their way into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For example, this provision concerning Inuit and the holistic view that they hold, indicating that Inuit are an integral part of Arctic ecosystems, and that our hunting, fishing, and other harvesting activities have always been in harmony with and an important part of Arctic ecosystems overall, and that we have a profound relationship with the natural world, and that it has multiple dimensions: economic, social, cultural, and spiritual, and that we as Arctic Indigenous peoples should be directly involved in the management and conservation of the Arctic region, our traditional territories. Furthermore, the Arctic policy from an Inuit perspective highlighted our knowledge. Some may recall from other presentations by Inuit the welcoming speech of Eben Hobson, who highlighted the intricate knowledge that we have seen Inuit demonstrate and not ever demonstrated by any others. The important knowledge of the sea ice in particular. And the ICC Arctic policy itself points out not only the significance and importance of our knowledge, but also Western scientific knowledge as being both valid systems of knowledge that should be integrated and harmonized in order to provide the world community really with the best possible information relating to terrestrial and marine ecosystems on which to base their decisions. If one thinks about this against the backdrop of the negotiation of an international legally binding treaty on plastics and microplastics, it's clear that the knowledge and the observations and the monitoring of our own people is significant to a host of different international instruments, including the one under discussion and negotiation right now. Again, Indigenous knowledge, the importance and the significance of our knowledge. And this is relevant in so many different international fora, at the national level, and significantly at the regional and at the local level. It is so significant that Indigenous peoples are beginning to prepare their own definitions in order to provide the rationale and to articulate the significance and importance of Indigenous knowledge. This I don't know, maybe the best way to say it is that the powerful force of our knowledge in terms of the global crisis of climate change, as well as initiatives like the current one concerning plastics and microplastics, it has required an articulation of what our knowledge is and how we can make a contribution to all of this activity. So what is on the screen is a part of the definition that was advanced by the Inuit Circumpolar Council, a way to articulate all the diverse elements of the knowledge and the accumulation of biological, physical, cultural, spiritual systems, and the long-term experience of this, the fact that it's intergenerational or multi-generational, and that it is a dynamic and continuing process that comes from the decades, centuries ago to the present, and is relevant to future generations also. In relation to this present negotiation, many people are familiar with the time that Indigenous peoples from the Arctic, but also from across the globe, have spent on defining what we believe to be our fundamental human rights. The result of an over 25-year process of dialogue and negotiation within the United Nations and between Indigenous peoples and UN member states, nation states, including the United States, Canada, Denmark, and the Russian Federation, to achieve clarity on the nature of our rights as Indigenous peoples. I should say that we're not talking about new rights. We're talking about influencing the UN system, the UN human rights regime, with our distinct understanding that is built upon, as I said earlier, the principles and elements that were articulated in the Inuit Arctic policy. Some of the rights that are, and before I go any further, are interrelated, interconnected, indivisible, and significant in ways that many don't understand. Hence the 25-year period of trying to express and tell the story of our experience out there and on the ground and coastal seas and on the sea ice. The effort really, there's so much to say about the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but the comment I made earlier about some of the principles and elements of the Inuit Arctic policy finding their way into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For example, at one point in time, the cluster of Articles 25 to 30 in the UN Declaration actually made specific and explicit reference to sea ice. So the rights to lands, territories, and resources made reference to sea ice. But unfortunately, because the instrument is supposed to be universal and sea ice isn't universal, it fell to the drafting room floor. But if one takes into account the use of the term territories, which the International Labor Organization has articulated as the total environment, when we make reference to lands, territories, and resources, we felt satisfied that it captured our understanding of what our rights are to our traditional lands, territories, and resources, or at least lands that we've traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. The UN Declaration also affirms our rights to hunting, fishing, and harvesting. Unfortunately, the term that has crystallized in international human rights law is subsistence, and we are all familiar with that here in Alaska because of the unfortunate provisions of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Nevertheless, it's important to highlight that the UN Declaration does affirm our rights to our way of life, so hunting, fishing, and harvesting. Also related to all of the international environmental law treaties is our right to the productive capacity of our environment. Article 29 highlights not only the productive capacity of our natural world, our environment, our ecosystems, but also there's a corresponding obligation on the part of state governments, including the United States, to ensure that we have the productive capacity of the environment or the natural world that we depend upon. Article 32, paragraph 3 makes reference to mitigation of adverse impacts, and this may be directly relevant depending on how things go in relation to the negotiation on the International Treaty on Plastics and Microplastics. I won't go into this long list of small print as to what we've seen in relation to the impacts of climate change. And this is just a quick list of some of the coastal Inuit communities' documentation of impacts of climate change, from obviously warming temperatures to the impacts on preservation of food, rapid changes in the quality, timing, and formation of sea ice, algal blooms, decrease in the types of species that are present and available, which of course has impacts on biodiversity and food insecurity. But I'm sure that this list has grown in even the last 12 months as far as the impacts of climate change. And when I wrote the foreword and referred to the term compounding, you can see that the wave after wave after wave of impact in the Arctic region. It's cumulative, it's compounding. I mean, if we go as far back as the Chernobyl accident and the atmospheric deposit of radioactive materials, it's like one wave and then another and another and another. And of course, Arctic shipping, because of climate change, is another cluster of impacts that, again, are compounding the threats that we're seeing in relation to plastics and microplastics. I know I don't have to tell any of the indigenous peoples, again, out there on the coastal seas and the sea ice about the impacts of Arctic shipping, and this is bound to increase. We've already seen the increase. Of course, we're in terms of the present conditions, geopolitically and geostrategically, we're also seeing the increase of militarization and what nation states are afforded in terms of greater access to our traditional lands, territories, and resources. And obviously, things like the Central Arctic Ocean Fishing Agreement adds another layer of, or another wave, another powerful wave, as we understand nation states like China constantly scanning the globe for their own food security, their own energy security, their own national security. So this is why the Arctic-specific references in the Plastics and Microplastics Treaty are important. And we have precedent that has been set in the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants and the Minamata Convention. And on the screen illustrates the specific, again, explicit reference to Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities being particularly at risk. Also in the Minamata Convention, the italicized language, the particular vulnerabilities of Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities. I should note that, this didn't appear out of the altruism or goodwill of governments, but because of the advocacy of Arctic indigenous peoples. And I note this information because in our view, it's crucial that these dynamics and a specific Arctic reference appear in the legally binding treaty on plastic pollution. So it's crucial to acknowledge the impacts on Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples. It's crucial that the legally binding treaty make specific reference to the interrelated human rights of Arctic indigenous peoples, and that there's also recognition of indigenous knowledge. And if we go further, the importance and significance of the co-production of knowledge between the wisdom and intricate knowledge that indigenous peoples hold, but also Western science and their monitoring and documentation of the impacts of plastics and microplastics, as well as engendering allyship between indigenous peoples and Western scientists as to the impacts of plastics and microplastics. Obviously, this has impact upon our food security, which I referenced earlier in relation to climate change. This happens to be part of the definition of the Inuit Circumpolar Council in relation to what food security means, what the integrity of our cultural way of life happens to entail and all the diverse elements of it. So I could say more. In fact, I could spend hours lecturing on each of these slides, but I just appreciate the opportunity to quickly share some of these perspectives and really hope for the best in relation to the outcomes of the negotiations concerning a legally binding instrument. And the final note that I'll make is that it's clear that there are compounding threats, but even more significantly, that if we as Indigenous peoples are successful in crystallizing the important language about how all of these different crises impact us, we will then have another tool to safeguard our way of life, a tool that should be read as complementary to instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the ILO Convention number 169, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'll stop there. Again, a big thank you to ACAT and to the programs that you initiate and promote. So, kuyanakbak.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sambo Dorough. I'm really glad we could have you here to expand even more on what you wrote in the foreword of the report. It's such important insight. So thank you so much. And I'll hand it over now to Dr. Karlsson to share her screen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you see my screen well? Okay, great. Thank you for having me here. It's a true honor to get to speak with you all and to be listed among such amazing speakers, and also to work with ACAT on this report. I will be talking a little bit about plastics and human health, but I want to start by kind of taking a step back and looking at what plastics really are. If you look at it from a quite basic perspective, plastics are really a combination of carbon and chemicals. Most of these come from fossil fuels, but even if they don't, even if they come from bio-based sources, they're associated with very similar concerns. If we look a little bit closer at what they consist of, we can see that plastics are built from chemicals. Again, chemicals made from fossil fuels. So we have something that's known as monomers, which is, mono means one, so it's one unit of something. And then those are combined to create something that's known as polymers, which creates this backbone of plastic. Poly means many, so it's many of these repeating one unit. To this, other chemicals known as additives are added. These are different types of chemicals that are used to create specific properties for the plastics. This could be different colors, it can be malleability, it can be UV resistance, flame retardancy. It's different types of properties. So these three types of chemicals are all chemicals that are intentionally added to the plastics. In addition to that, there's also something that's known as non-intentionally added substances. These can be degradation products, so one chemical that degrades to something else. It can also be chemicals that come from recycling plastics, because when you recycle plastics, you're mixing several different materials that you don't know what they contain together, and the chemicals that are in those are moved to the new products or the new materials. Even though you didn't intentionally add them, they're still there. And this is really what plastics are, a set of different types of chemicals. And when we look at these chemicals a little bit closer, it is staggering how little we know about how many of these chemicals. So we know that there's more than 10,000, last number said 16,000 chemicals in plastics. Thousands of these do not have any hazard data in regulatory databases. So they're being used, they are in plastics, but we have no idea what the consequences are for the environment or for human health of using these. Of the ones that we do know something about, we know that a pretty high portion are chemicals of concern. This is a slightly older number. The newer number says around 4,000 of the chemicals that are used in plastics are of concern. And of those, only 128 are regulated globally throughout their full life cycle. There's a few chemicals that are also regulated in parts of the life cycle, such as wastes, or at least during trade as wastes. But globally, throughout their life cycle, 128 out of 16,000. And when we say chemicals of concern, what does that actually mean? It means that they're toxic. It means that they are carcinogen. It means that they are that they interfere with reproduction. That's what this abbreviation means, CMR. Or it means that they are toxic for specific organs. That's what this abbreviation means. Or it means that they're toxic for the aquatic environment. It can also mean that they're in combination with this are also persistent, meaning that they will be around for a very long time. And if we look at what the impacts for human health are of these chemicals, the list runs long. This is just sort of an overview illustration. This does not cover everything. This is done by Grid Arendal based on a UNEP report. And here we can see that plasticizers such as phthalates, which is a type of chemical that is used to make the plastic softer. It's used in a lot of different types of plastics. Or bisphenols, which is a type of chemical that is either used as these building blocks or as an additive, depending on context, also used in a lot of different types of plastics, are associated with neurodevelopmental disorders, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and that flame retardants are similarly associated with neurodevelopmental disorders, hormonal disorders, metabolic disease, and that both of these groups of chemicals have health conditions, have been linked to health conditions concerning reproductive health and pregnancy outcomes. This is extremely concerning. And aside from the chemicals, we also know that the plastics can break down into smaller pieces or be made in smaller pieces known as micro or nanoplastics. And the research has shown that these particles are found in a lot of different organs of the human body, even in the placenta. We know that we get these particles into our systems, and there have been links to health effects. A more recent study showed links to cardiac arrest with plastic particles. At IPEN, we've been working with plastics and chemicals for a long time, and we can see in global studies that these are really global problems. We can see how plastics are transporting toxic chemicals. We looked at beaches and found that something that's known as plastic pellets, which is what's used to make some types of plastics, all contain toxic chemicals. We looked at children bottles and found that even the bottles that were marked as bisphenol A free contained bisphenol A. So there's no transparency. We looked at toys from 10 different countries and found banned toxic chemicals in all of them. Some in such high concentrations that they would be classified as hazardous waste. And we looked at recycled plastics from all over the world and found that because when you mix plastics to recycle them, if there's no transparency on what is in the plastics, you have no idea what comes out. And we found that in all of the plastics that we tested, there were toxic chemicals. And this harms These chemicals harms human health and the environment throughout the full life cycle of plastics. And for recycled plastics, especially for workers that are constantly exposed to these chemicals, but have no idea what kind of chemicals. So we can see that plastics are transporting toxic chemicals into the environment, into our homes, and into our bodies with limited controls and no transparency. And you heard a little bit before about the plastics treaty. So just for those of you that are not familiar with this process, this is ongoing negotiations that started in 2022 when UNEA gave a mandate to negotiate an international treaty to address threats from plastic pollution throughout the full life cycle. And this has a potential to be really a key towards a toxic-free future, because plastics are chemicals, many of which are toxic to human health and the environment. But it does depend on what the decision makers decide to do with this treaty. So INC 4 just finished in Ottawa, and INC 5 is scheduled for November in Busan. And these are really important negotiations for the protection of human health. And Pam will go a little bit more into the recommendations that we have for these negotiations in her presentation. But I will stop here for now and leave it to Pam. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing this webinar, and I'm also honored to present with Dalee and Therese this morning, and thank you both for your excellent presentations. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. My name is Pam Miller, and I serve as Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics and co-chair of IPEN. And Alaska Community Action on Toxics is an environmental health and justice organization. We're based here in Alaska, in Anchorage, and we have community health researchers on Sivokak, which is the traditional name for St. Lawrence Island. This is our mission. We believe everyone has the right to clean air, clean water, and toxics-free food. So we do community-based research. We do work on education, outreach, community organizing, advocacy, and really ultimately to change policies at all levels so that it can be protective of human health and human rights of people throughout the world. So this report, as Therese mentioned, is a collaboration with IPEN, and we were so pleased to work with IPEN on this and very grateful. We're also very pleased to be a participating organization of IPEN. We prepared this report to inform and engage delegates to the 4th negotiating session for the new plastics treaty, as well as civil society, our Indigenous partners, and reporters. And the report incorporates the perspectives of Arctic Indigenous leaders, as well as over 250 scientific references. And I want to also give a special thank you to Dalee for contributing the foreword to the report. In the lower right-hand corner of the slide, you see the authors of the report, which not only included Therese and me, but also Dr. Samari Singwanat Medina and Vaiwahi, both of the ACAT staff. We had graduate student interns, Tristan Fernery, also our staff member, Dylan Jones, and Samantha Tracy, who contributed. I mentioned the forward again. Thank you, Dalee, so much. And Charles Margulis and Karen Hahn and Vito Buasante with IPEN also contributed a lot in terms of design and editing. And photos and photo credits also go to Samaris and Dylan Jones. So thank you again so much. And I want to say that the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus represented many Indigenous nations throughout the world. And we had 3 people from Alaska, Vaiwahi, Delbert Pungawi, and Chantel Miklahook, who were there representing Arctic Indigenous peoples from Alaska. The Inuit Circumpolar Council was a well-represented and powerful presence at the negotiations, including the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council of Canada. The report really talks about the convergence among chemicals, plastics, and climate. We know that in the Arctic, and Dalee illustrated this so well, the Arctic is warming at a rate 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. We also know that the Arctic has become a hemispheric sink for chemicals that are transported on wind and ocean currents from all over the hemisphere, and that climate warming exacerbates this problem of the mobilization of chemicals and plastics into the Arctic and within the Arctic, because as the climate is warming at a very rapid rate, with sea ice melting, permafrost melting, glaciers melting, this is mobilizing sequestered chemicals and plastics from these ice stores into some of the most productive places that are so critically important for the traditional fishing and hunting of Indigenous peoples of the Arctic. The Arctic is also, as I mentioned, a hemispheric sink for chemicals, so that Arctic Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, have some of the highest body burdens of many of these chemicals of any populations on Earth. Oh, I'm going to go back here. I just wanted to say that this dramatic loss of Arctic sea ice, permafrost, and glaciers is having profound effects on the ecology and human communities of the North. And scientists are now forecasting the disappearance of summer sea ice as early as 2035, thus making coastal communities more vulnerable to storm events and erosion. Melting sea ice accelerates climate warming in the North because as it melts, the reflective surface diminishes and the ocean absorbs more heat. This results in a feedback loop of further acceleration of sea ice thaw. Carbon stores in the form of carbon dioxide and methane are also released to the atmosphere as sea ice is thawing. And this, again, forms another feedback loop resulting in quicker climate change. Methane is about 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So as temperatures increase in the North, we see melting permafrost releasing more carbon dioxide and methane. This illustrates, and this map is courtesy of Dr. Melanie Bergman with the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research. This just shows the documented concentrations of microplastics throughout the Arctic, in sea ice, in surface and pelagic or open waters, and in sediments on the seafloor and in beaches. This slide represents some of the findings in the report, and we go into a lot more detail in the report. But microplastics are concentrated in the formation of sea ice that then serves as a medium for the transport of plastics within and into Arctic environments. These plastics are remobilized when sea ice melts, and with the dramatic declines in the extent and thickness of sea ice, we see that more and more plastics are being released into some of the most important ecological zones and critical areas for traditional fishing and hunting. So again, Arctic sea ice is really a major global sink for microplastics, and we're seeing the highest concentrations of plastics along the edges of the sea ice where the sea ice is melting. And as Therese talked about, thousands of tons of chemical additives that are used in plastics are also transported with this plastic debris into the Arctic and other remote regions of the planet. These are some of the concerns that we have about the effects and accumulation of microplastics in Arctic fish and wildlife. We now know that Arctic marine mammals, including all of these species of ice seals, walrus, and all the major marine mammal whales of, the whales of the Arctic are accumulating microplastics. And not only are they found in the blood tissues of the animals, but these microplastics are also translocating into all these different tissues: lung, blubber, liver, the acoustic fat pads, and melon, which is the fatty tissue that is very important for communications in toothed whales. They serve as a sound lens in the toothed whales. The Arctic seabirds, many species of Arctic seabirds, are accumulating microplastics, especially the ones that feed on plankton, and that also there are now numerous studies that show that seabirds are also accumulating chemicals that are transferred from the microplastics into their bodies. In a study on seabirds done by Veronica Padula, this study found that phthalates, which is a common plastics additive, is found in 100% of 10 different species of seabirds collected along the Aleutian archipelago, and that these levels of phthalates were very significantly higher in the diving and plankton feeding seabirds. This slide illustrates that petrochemicals are rapidly becoming the largest driver of global energy consumption. As the transition to renewable energy systems is progressing and the demand for fossil fuels as energy sources is set to peak in 2030, the fossil fuel industry is investing significantly more in the use of oil and gas as feedstock for petrochemicals and plastics. The oil industry projections themselves show that the percentage of total oil demand for petrochemical feedstock will increase from its current level of less than 20% to as much as 50% by 2050. So this is a really dramatic illustration and projections from the industry themselves that show their heavy investment in chemicals and plastics to make up for the loss of fossil fuels that have been used for direct combustion. Therese and Dalee both talked about the importance of the global treaty on plastics that is currently under negotiations. And this is a statue kind of illustrating the global problem that we have with plastics and the critical importance of reaching an agreement on plastics that's legally binding and strong, and that incorporates elements of health and human rights. These are just some of the recommendations that we have from the report, and I won't go through all of these, but we really have to focus on the upstream side to limit production, shift to clean renewable energy, and stop the expansion of the petrochemical industry. These principles are of the Louisville Charter for Environmental Justice, the Jemez principles, and the Just Transition Framework are really critically important to ensure environmental justice and health for everyone. And also, as Dalee mentioned, we need to incorporate some of the key principles of the Stockholm Convention. And this also includes the elimination of new chemicals that harm the Arctic. These are some of the very important parts of the treaty that we are really fighting for, to fundamentally protect health and the environment, to end the production and use of toxic chemicals and plastics, remove the toxic impacts at all stages of the life cycle of plastics, banning the recycling of plastics that contain hazardous chemicals, because we know, as Therese illustrated, that these chemicals and plastics are ending up in our homes from recycled plastics and in our environment. Right to know is very, very critical, and to base this treaty fundamentally on health and human rights. And speaking of human rights, I think these are important statements from Dr. Marcos Orellana, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. And he talks about here how each stage of the plastics cycle has direct and adverse impacts on the enjoyment of human rights. And it goes into more detail, but just again illustrates the critical importance of having this treaty be fundamentally based on human rights of both present and future generations. And these are some statements from Indigenous peoples that we work with. Our elder, Delbert Pungawi, who attended the INC4 in Ottawa very recently, talking about the urgency to protect the Arctic from the triple crisis of climate, chemicals, and plastics. And a quote at the bottom there from one of our board members, "We don't eat just one chemical, we eat the whole fish." And this is so important because of the multiple and synergistic and, as Dalee said, compounding effects of chemicals, plastics, and climate in the Arctic. And this is Annie Aloha, and we recognize her with every presentation that we give, the work that we do every day. She was a health aid leader and elder from Savunga on Sivukak, and devoted her life to drawing attention to the health disparities associated with the military contamination on Sivukak, on St. Lawrence Island. And as she said, "I will fight until I melt." So I thank you all very much and welcome any comments or discussion.
Thank you both for those excellent presentations and for walking us through the science and the recommendations of this really incredible report. And now we'll move into the Q&A part of the webinar. Unfortunately, Dr. Sambo Dorough won't be able to join us for this portion, but we were very glad she could be here for the main part. And I see a few questions already. I think we can start with one about the status of the plastics treaty, and what are the most pressing issues and what are the next steps for this plastics treaty?
Therese, I think that one's for you.
I can start and you can add things as we go. So the current status is that we had the 4th meeting in Ottawa just now in just a while ago, and just a few weeks ago really. And the next one will be in November in Busan, and that is scheduled to be the last one, but there's still a lot of text to go through. So where we are in the negotiations is that countries have gone through what was a zero draft. It's known as a zero draft, which is something that has been prepared for them based on their submissions and discussions, and created something that's known as a first draft, which will serve kind of as the basis for really starting to negotiate. So at this point, the text really contains all different options, and then it's up to countries to negotiate and find agreements on how to move forward. We don't know if it will. It is scheduled to be the last one, but then there might be other meetings, and we know that there's an intersessional work that will also be happening now in August. And on that, I will also touch a little bit on the second question here on, if I may, on chemicals, and because the intersessional work that will happen now between INC4, the last meeting, and the next meeting will be a discussion specifically on different approaches to chemicals and plastic products, and to criteria. So here we are recommending that there should be, for example, a group-based approach rather than a chemical by chemical approach. Yes, the Stockholm Convention is an incredible tool, and it is really the only tool that we have today to ban chemicals in that way globally. but it is a slow process, and although there have been groups of chemicals that have been banned under the Stockholm Convention, it is often smaller groups or sometimes even just individual chemicals. So under the Plastics Treaty, we are recommending that there should be more of a group-based approach to chemicals. If you want to add something there, Pam, please feel free.
I think you covered it very well.
Yeah, thank you. We can move on to the next question from Soma about if there have been any exposure assessment studies in local Indigenous communities looking at correlations with diet or exposure studies to do with airborne exposures.
Well, I can speak to that. We have done extensive community-based research in the Northern Bering Sea around Sivilcock with the tribes, in partnership with the tribes of Sivilcock and several different universities. And all of the studies, our published papers, are available on our website at akaction.org. But we have done exposure assessments. We've measured chemical contaminants, including PCBs, legacy chemical contaminants such as PCBs and pesticides, as well as heavy metals. And we've looked at flame retardant chemicals and the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, in a whole range of environmental media, air, water, as well as a number of, and the main traditional foods that people rely on in that region: fish, marine mammals, as well as invertebrates and medicinal plants, greens, and berries. And then we've also looked at many of these chemicals and chemical classes in people through biomonitoring of blood, hair, and we're conducting those studies in a continuing way. We have a current project called Protecting Future Generations, where we're measuring those chemicals and health outcomes in children aged 2 to 12. We've measured these chemicals in adults, and then we also have a project that we're working on right now to assess the long-term health harms and environmental consequences of the military contamination. So looking both at the main local sources, military contamination on the island, but also this phenomenon of global transport of chemicals into the Arctic and how they affect the environment, the traditional foods, and health of people. And we've connected exposures with disruptions of endocrine disruption, including thyroid and reproductive hormone disruption in both fish and in people. Oh, and I should add that this is going on in our region of the Arctic, but there is a coordinated program, a circumpolar Arctic program known as the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And if you go to their website, there are a number of studies and reports that have come out looking at chemical contamination, now starting to include microplastics in their research program as well.
Thank you. I see another question about why can't plastic manufacturers be required to manage their product and waste from cradle to grave? Either of you want to take that?
I can start and you can add on. So from IPEN's side, we think it's important that that the producer pays, or the polluter pays principle, is enacted in the Plastics Treaty, and that it ensures that producers should be held responsible for the consequences throughout the life cycle of plastics. Not necessarily through EPR, which often has very big limitations and often ends up focusing just, EPR is extended producer responsibility, which often ends up just focusing on plastics as waste and not necessarily enacting that level of responsibility that we think it's important to see under the treaty. But we especially talk about this under financing, where it's important that the plastics industry are called to finance the pollution remediation and mitigation.
And I might add as well that we've been really working to fight the vested interest and conflict of interest that industry is trying to bring to bear in the negotiations of this plastics treaty. We see their influence on the governments that are coming together to negotiate this treaty. And that's why the polluter pays principle is so important. But we also have to work to limit their influence over the negotiation and outcome of this treaty. And that's still a very tough battle.
Thank you both. Yeah. How about the question, how are microplastics measured? Is it by looking for chemicals we know are used in plastics as a proxy?
So I used to work, before this, I used to work specifically on developing methods for measuring microplastics. And there's so many out there, and I'm sure there's even more out there now because it's really big field of study. But oftentimes it is really through measuring particles. In some cases, there would be some type of proxy work, but typically it would be you take a sample and you use different methods to be able to extract the plastics and to be able to measure them. It's a very laborious work. It does take quite a lot of time. So all this data that you're seeing, there's so much research behind it. There's so much research behind these numbers and so many hours of work from the people that have been working both in community research and in academic research and indigenous research. There's so much data underbuilding these conclusions, but it is a laborious work to measure microplastics.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we have time for just one more question. How about this one from Yara? How much plastics pollution in the Arctic is from local regional sources versus from global sources transported over long distances? And are there Arctic specific solutions, like maybe new shipping rules?
It's a very good question. Thank you, Yareth. I think so far very little is known to establish proportionately what sources are from global long-range transport versus local. But I think for local solutions, there are ways to limit the uses of plastics that are being brought into communities, safer disposal methods, because we do see a lot of plastics that are disposed of in open dump sites that then are transmitted directly into the freshwater and marine environments. So I think just better efforts to reduce our overall uses of plastics in the North and in the Arctic, and better and safer disposal methods. And that includes not burning plastics because in so many rural Alaska villages that I've been in, we see open burning of plastic waste that then returns and exposes the community to dangerous levels of pollutants that result from the burning of plastics, such as dioxins and furans and other dangerous chemicals. So I think we really need to focus on the upstream again to prevent the production and use of plastics. And that's not just in the Arctic, but everywhere. Eliminate the use, especially of unnecessary plastics, single use and other plastics that we can eliminate in our lives in favor of safer alternatives, and then really paying attention to how we dispose of these wastes and finding better and safer ways to dispose of them, because we know, unfortunately, we still have this problem, but we really do need to eliminate the production and use of plastics overall.
Thank you, Pam. That's a great point to end on. And I think that's all the questions we have time for. Thank you so much to our speakers for being here and for your insights in this discussion. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us and the questions you sent in. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website shortly, and it'll also be sent to your emails in the next day or so. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.